Hi, welcome to Developmental Ladder, an interview podcast designed to connect parents and caregivers to professors and scientists who study human development from infancy into adulthood. Today, we spoke with Dr. Colleen Colaner, an associate professor at the University of Missouri. Dr. Colaner's research focuses on how communication shapes and sustains relationships in complex, diverse, and modern family structures and experiences. A major focus of her research is communication in adoptive families, examining how adoptive parents' communication with and about birth families sustains adoptee well-being. In this episode, we discuss the structures behind open adoption and the flexibility and adaptability involved in an open adoption. Hello, Dr. Colaner. Welcome to Developmental Ladder. I'm Mandaran, a first-year graduate student in the psychology department at the University of Missouri. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your academic position?
I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. I got my PhD at the University of Nebraska in 2011, and then got hired on at Mizzou and have been there ever since.
All right. So then could you please tell us a little bit about your research topics?
Yeah, and so I study family communication. And so very broadly, that is how families communicate. More specifically, I'm really interested in families with complex structures and how they use communication to make sense of who they are and to help other people understand who they are. And so as we know, the modern family has a lot of different configurations, and we used to maybe assume that the family was like heterosexual marriage, biological children, no divorce, everyone looked like each other. And the reality is that the modern family is multicultural and varies along legal and biological arrangements. And so we have step families and adoptive families and cohabitating and a lot of different permutations. And the more we depart from that assumption that families are that heterosexual biological unit, the more we have to make sense of that through our talk, both within the family and outside of the family. So I've done a lot of that work with adoption, and so how adoption is formed through law and language. And so once adoption is finalized, as far as the courts are done, that's really it. But then families continue on making sense of who they are as a family and helping the child understand how they are centered within a network of biological and legal family members.
Got it. So your research focuses mainly on communication and then narrowing it down to the relationship between adoptive families and everything that goes with it.
Yeah.
So then diving deeper, what is the communication model between adoptive families and birth families?
Yeah. And so I think the way we used to do it was that adoption was shrouded in secrecy. Back in the 50s, if someone had a pregnancy that was unexpected outside of a union of marriage, they were sort of sent away and then they would come back, and that child would be placed with people who looked like them, and the child might not even know they were adopted. And that just wasn't good for anyone. And so over the decades, adoption has become increasingly open. And so it shifted towards talking to the child about the adoption early and often, to help the child sort of understand what that adoption means for self and for family relationships. And then it started shifting even more to actively including birth families. And so a lot of factors came together for this. One was with Roe versus Wade, people had more choice about whether they wanted to carry a pregnancy to term. And so there were fewer babies that were unwanted that were carried to term. And then, they had more rights then. And so a lot of birth moms said, well, I am going to birth this baby, but if I do, I kind of want to know how things are going, and I want to be in the loop. And so open adoption really emerged as a response to birth mother desire. And what we have found is that open adoption tends to be good for everyone involved, that the birth mom and her family, they have, it's still a very difficult relationship and a difficult choice, but they just have a little bit more closure. This question of who are they? Where are they? Having an answer to that allows for some grief resolution. It helps the adoptee know, why am I good at piano? Why does my nose look like this? Those are always the things that come up when I talk to adoptees. And just to like, not knowing, a lot of times they would create these like fantasies or just like this rumination. And oftentimes the answer is much less interesting than the possibilities,
Yeah.
And so some of the adoptees I talked to who didn't know, this one woman in particular, she was like, I didn't know who my birth mom was, but I was really good at singing. So I always imagined that she was either Judy Garland, Karen Carpenter, or Gloria Stefan. And then she later in life met her birth mom, and it was not that exciting or diverse, right? And so it just helps adoptees know a little bit more. And then adoptive parents tend to be more satisfied as well. They have access to medical history. They can get information that helps their child understand themselves. So by and large, open adoption is great, but it's tricky. Grodevant is an adoption researcher who's talked about open adoption as being forged by relationship pioneers, that there's not really a model or a map. And so families are just kind of figuring it out, and they're collaborating and working together to figure out what that looks like. And how that's healthiest for everyone involved.
So then in that case, as these families try to figure out what is the best way to take, what are some common ways these families tend to communicate with each other?
Yeah. And so the biggest thing that we're finding is this idea of collaboration. There's like a very Western model of parenting that like, I own my kids, right? That they're extensions of me. I have authority over my child. And there's also this notion that kids can only have two parents. And we know that, there's a lot of adults that function as parents in like this larger village of people. And so having this like ownership or like, this is my child mentality is really difficult. But families who work together and it's kind of big love, they have kids that are usually a little bit like more accepting and healthier with the whole thing. Jim Gritter is an adoption practitioner who has this awesome quote who says, we shouldn't be asking who this child belongs to. We should be asking who belongs to this child. And so it's the families that, have this open sort of a horseshoe rather than a circle that are doing the best.
All right. So yeah, that is really nice that where if it's open communication, people like are open to understanding, and the idea of having not just an ownership to a child really opens up the idea.
Yeah, it's a relationship. Yeah.
So then seeing that open adoption has become this primary form of private adoption now, why is it important to understand the structures of communication between these families beyond just the fact that it is healthier for everybody involved?
So talk is really the way that it's navigated, and we're co-creating what this family looks like through our talk, both with the birth parent and about the birth parent. And so we shape the reality of the adoption through our communication. And so we have found some evidence that parents tend to talk in positive ways about birth parents, that when they tell stories to their child, they say, they loved you very much, but, they were really young and their lives weren't very stable and they were worried that would hurt you. So they placed you out of love. And so if we construct that positive story, you can imagine how different that might be than if we, they were addicts, they were unsafe, irresponsible. If we really painted them in a negative light, that would change so much. And so we construct this through the talk. And so we need to really focus on like, what are these processes that really support families in that construction?
All right. So then moving on a little further, in normal families, there are naming structures where there's a mom, there's a dad, and then if you look at some extended families or families that are separated, there's step parents involved, step siblings. How do the naming strategies in an adoptive and like a family around an adoptive child work, and how do they help provide an identity structure to everybody involved?
Totally. And so it's funny that you use the word normal. There's no normal family, right?
Yeah.
Like families are
Yeah.
just kind of whatever. But yes, naming is a really, really important strategy in adoption. One of the studies that we looked at was how they used address terms in adoptive families to reference the birth mom. And so some of them, most of them just called the birth mom by her first name. So they'd be like, hi, Sue, and like, oh,
Yeah.
Sue's here, right? And like, that's how they would address both to her and to the child. But some used variations of that, like Mama Sue, or some that had like a multicultural element might use a term from that original culture. So like Madre or Oma. And some just didn't use any name. They'd be like, hey, because like having to commit to a name like really solidifies that, and they didn't want to. And what's really interesting is that the terms that we use to address those names, it both affects and reflects the relationship, right? And so, if I'm a birth mom and this family calls me Mama Sue, I'm like, oh, they remember, like they see me as that mother, versus Sue would just be like, okay, yeah, we're just on a first name basis here. When people use your name, you feel seen and heard. So then if they never used your name, you might like just have that sense of it's very impersonal. Yeah. And so it both reflects how they're feeling about that relationship, and then it affects, the first time you can think of like in a step family when a child says dad instead of, like Bob. So yeah, the names that we give are really, really important. Another way that naming has come up too is in international adoption and transracial adoption. And so there's always this tension of like, are we going to change the child's name? Are we going to retain that original culture name?
Right.
A lot of children that were adopted like from Korea or from Haiti or from Ethiopia, they have names that aren't sort of conventional in US society. And sometimes parents want to pick the name. And so there's lots of different configurations, but like sometimes they'll use like a cultural name as the middle name, right? Or they'll retain that cultural name and really solidify that as part of the child's identity. And so again, this is just like creating really important aspects of that relational culture and of that personal identity.
So again, it is, I guess, the fact that everything has to be open and understood, and every family is not normal, and everybody is deciding what to do is the way to go. And so is it similar in the sense that these positive relationships are fostered through, if you give like a name, like not just say by their first name, but give them a name, and then you keep moving on in that relationship that way. That is pretty cool to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, so moving on to a discussion a little bit about privacy management between adoptive and birth families as a form of open communication, information is shared and exchanged. What are some situations where privacy concerns may arise, and how are these concerns addressed in a modern world where social media and information is available as soon as you look for it?
Totally. Yeah. So social media, a lot of adoption practitioners say that they hate that part of it, because like there is so much just out there. And one thing about open adoption is that, the most important part is the collaboration, but what's not true is that closer is better. Right. And so boundary management and emotional distance regulation is a really important part of healthy open adoption relationships. And so having good boundaries and having, sort of a sense of, your quasi family. So you're, kind of our family, but we also have our own structure. Families that kind of violate that emotional distance regulation, sometimes it's a little bit too chaotic, and, closer isn't better. More open isn't always better. So regulating that through what we say and what we don't say, and maintaining that privacy. And so, adoptive parents have to kind of figure out what feels the most comfortable, and who owns that information. And so let's say like a child gets like a cancer diagnosis or has like a mental health diagnosis, like anxiety or ADHD. that's the child's information, but it also, in this Western society, we feel like children are extensions of ourselves. So we feel like as a parent, it's our information, but then as a birth parent, is it their information? And so deciding who gets ownership to information about the child. And then let's say, does the birth family get ownership of information about the adoptive family? Let's say maybe one of the parents has lost a job, or they're having marital issues, or one of the parents gets a health diagnosis that obviously influences the child, but does the birth parent like have a right to know that? So it's just something that parents have to navigate. And then when we talk about social media, like once we post, everyone who sees that can own that information, right? And so one of the really tricky ways that's come up is through pictures. And so like maybe after like a open adoption visit where, the birth and adoptive family got together and they, took pictures of everyone together. And then that birth parent shares a picture of the child on Facebook. And they might even say like, it's my mini me, or they might say like, I got to see my child today. And the adoptive parents are like, first of all, like, I'm not okay with that language. And I'm also not okay with like you posting pictures. So anticipating like when those, the theory would call it boundary turbulence, like anticipating when those moments might come of fuzzy boundaries, and sort of talking them through and coordinating those boundaries really just helps the relationship. And so it can be kind of an awkward conversation, like we tend to not be that direct, especially in the Midwest, where like everything's fine, but just being able to be like, listen, we're just like not into social media for our kid right now. So like, is that okay if we just like, take pictures, but let's just like keep them offline. Is that cool? Just having that like easy conversation, we're finding saves a lot of heartache down the road.
Yeah. So is it best to just define boundaries and ways of enforcing it early on instead of just
way easier to like set it beforehand than to like get your feelings hurt and then have to have an awkward conversation. But it's tricky because like, obviously like with social media and pictures, like that might be kind of an obvious thing. But like there might be things that you don't anticipate, like, look, like it's fine if you know my address, but I don't really want like, so and so. And so like, then like someone like shows up at your door and you're like, how'd you get this address? And like, well, you never told me not to. And it's like, well, I didn't think to. So it can be hard to anticipate what might be difficult down the road.
So then what are some ways like modern law or people involved are trying to find ways around it? Because like social media and just like the open access to information is such a new idea, and the use to it is just ever increasing as time goes on. How is it managed? Is it just early on there, like there's this set structure defined by the authorities and then everybody should follow it? Or is it more on the, I guess, adoptive families where this is what we want and then it is enforced that way?
Yeah. And so, adoptive parents, they really are the gatekeepers. And so once that transfer of parental rights is completed, the birth family really, they don't have any legal authority. There are some states that are considering more legally binding open adoption agreements where it would be maybe similar to like a child visitation, like after a divorce that, like I'm not the residential parent, but I have legally protected rights of visiting. So right now it's really all in the adoptive parent, and there's not a lot of like oversight or guidance or support, which, gives adoptive parents a lot of freedom, but it's also really tricky. And so, really good adoption agencies are facilitating this conversation at placement. And so having like that adoption social worker as like a mediator, and they've seen so much of this, and, working with researchers, like I like to work with agencies so much because like they see so much. And then I'm saying, well, this is what I'm seeing. And then saying like, listen, your address, like social media, like these are things that really come up. And so let's, facilitate that conversation at the get-go, and like helping them create, like, what does a good adoption relationship look like to you? And the birth mom might say like, well, I really want once a month. And the adoptive family saying like, we really can't do once a month, but how about every 3 months, and they can like kind of negotiate that together. And then the adoption social worker can like help them anticipate any potential pitfalls.
All right. Well, last but not least, what is the take home message from your research other than the fact that adoptive parents need to be very communicative with
Yeah.
everybody involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that big love is just kind of it. Like whether you're an adoptive parent or not, I think that our relationships, um, they're fluid and they're life-giving. And I think that sometimes we, especially with our kids, get so mindful of like how we're controlling our child and viewing our child as an extension of ourselves. And I think adoption creates an interesting model where we can like invite a child into the family, and know that that child, lots of people belong to them. And to me, I think that's a really great model, in extending the borders of the family to allow for, like what Hillary Clinton talked about, like it takes a village, and I've
Yeah.
seen funny memes about like, they say it takes a village. So do I just call somebody? Like, where is this village? Right. And,
Yeah.
really facilitating. We know that kids do best when they have lots of adults that are invested in them. And so I think that's a takeaway for all families.
Thank you so much for your time today. I
Yes.
really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.